So another stat that's kind of interesting, we have 35 states voting on ballot measures. That's 205 million residents, so a little over 2/3 of the US population that will be directly affected by decisions made by the voters. So that's why ballot measures are compelling, is because the voters are making the decisions themselves, and that's a lot of people being affected by these. So let's look at the next slide. So this is just a kind of a rough look, so you can get an idea of which states have ballot measures. You can see the darker shades have more ballot measures. So California jumps out, as it always does. So that's a kind of a map of where we're looking at. And that's all ballot measures, not just initiatives. We'll look into kind of which states have initiatives this year. There are 17 of those a little bit later. Let's look at the next slide. Thank you. All right, so let's look at initiatives more. So the chart at the top of this slide shows sort of a trend. And from a peak in 1996, we've been following this downward trend in the number of ballot measures on the ballot in even numbered years and odd numbered years, but this is about even numbered years. And that includes initiatives. So from 2006 especially onward, you can see that there's a pretty strong downward trend in the number of initiatives put on the ballot. And we theorize this is for a lot of reasons, including an increase in the regulations on the initiative process, as well as better lawsuits and more experienced lawyers fighting these things. But this year that number is going to jump back up to 74. This is more initiatives than we've ever seen since 2006. So we're kind of jumping. There's a significant spike in the number of initiatives on the ballot. And we can look at kind of compare this to the average from 1980 through 2014, which is 54. So that kind of demonstrates this is a pretty unusual year as far as the number of initiatives on the ballot. And Ballotpedia predicted this spike in 2014 when voter turnout was very low. So this decreased the signature requirements required to put measures on the ballot through these petitions, because in many states that requirement is tied to the number of votes cast in the previous gubernatorial election, or sometimes the election for the Secretary of State. So we saw 11 states with a pretty significant drop in the number of signatures required. It was like a 30%, more than 30% drop in California. I think Nevada had the most dramatic drop. It dropped by about 47%. But 11 states, it all of a sudden became easier. So people responded by proposing more initiatives because they saw an opportunity. And so we saw about between 900 and 1,000 initiatives filed with state officials this year. That compares to about 600 in 2014 and a little over 600, maybe 700 in 2012. So there's a spike in the number proposed, and then there was a spike in the number that actually made the ballot as well. I think that's one factor. It's the factor that allowed us to sort of predict this spike. But there are lots of factors that remain for why initiatives are put on the ballot. Things like success about a certain topic. So we'll look at that more specifically with the topic of marijuana. This is a record year for the number of marijuana legalizations proposed, and as well as actually being on the ballot. So when you have a state like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska succeed through the initiative process in changing policy, that motivates people with the same policy ideas and national groups to sort of push that strategy forward. And that's happened with a lot of things. So minimum wage is another one where there's been a lot of success through initiatives, and so we also see that issue on the ballot. And those are just sort of two examples of topics that have had success and are therefore continuing to show up on the ballot. And then I want to explain briefly why we're talking so much about initiatives, but that's only half the ballot measures on the ballot, right? But in the end, they're going to be the most compelling, the most controversial, and the most interesting. And one way we know that is that over 90% of all the ballot measure campaign funds that we're tracking right now are going towards citizen-initiated measures. And we'll go into details on that at the end of this presentation, but that's sort of why we're focusing on initiatives. Look at the next slide. All right, so let's quickly talk about what all of these are about. They're not all the measures aren't about marijuana. So there's just a huge range of topics that these measures are about. Everything from pornography in California with the condom requirement measure. You have measures about alcohol, law enforcement. You have the death penalty is on the ballot in 3 states. And then there's things like transportation funding, bond issues, pensions, retirement age for judges is a pretty common one this year. So overall, we're tracking at least 50 unique issues addressed by these ballot measures. And so I've kind of broken out some of the really notable topics here, and we can talk about them in terms of sort of the population affected and the states across which these changes will be made. So marijuana jumps out as a big one. Like I said, this is a record year for the number of issues about marijuana on the ballot. You have 82 million residents that could see looser restrictions regarding marijuana. That's across 9 states. 5 of those states will be voting on recreational marijuana. Minimum wage, you have 21.6 million residents across 5 states that could see larger minimum wages because of ballot measures in November. There are no minimum wage decreases on the ballot. We have gun control, about 50.5 million residents across 4 states with measures that could kind of increase the number of gun control regulations on the ballot. This ranges from background checks to something in Washington that would allow judges to deny access to guns to certain individuals. Tobacco tax increases, 51.4 million residents. Healthcare is an interesting topic this year. Tons of money being spent on specifically 2 measures in California about healthcare. But overall, that issue is before voters in 4 states and could affect 54.7 million residents. And then taxes is always a huge one. We've got 123.3 million residents across a myriad of states that could see and actually make policy changes regarding taxes. And these range from anything, including like increasing taxes, lockbox measures to actually dedicate tax revenue and tax exemptions. So we outline all of this on the site. So there'll be links available and overview pages. And I recommend taking a look at kind of all the topics that we cover, just because there are some that are unique, some that you don't really realize are in the hands of voters. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so an interesting factor when it comes to initiatives is how they get on the ballot. So with initiatives, you need some sort of group or some sort of drive to get them on the ballot, to collect all the signatures required. It ranges from tens of thousands of signatures to hundreds of thousands of signatures, depending on the state you're in. And of course, there are a myriad of regulations about how to collect those signatures, and the difficulty ranges among all the states. There are 26 states with the initiative process. Out of that 26, there are 17 that have citizen-initiated measures on the ballot this year. So just to recap the numbers, 79 measures this year total were put on the ballot through petitions. One of those was a veto referendum that happened before November election. So that's 78 for the November election. So we've been tracking how much was spent on the campaigns to get these on the ballot. So not counting Oklahoma's 3 initiatives, because their filing deadline hasn't passed yet. We don't know. There's been a total of nearly 76 million spent just on the petition drives to get these on the ballot. And so that's before all the campaign spending comes in. That's just to put these before voters. So we have more than half of that spent in California. California had 14 initiatives, 1 veto referendum, and proponents spent $44.7 million to get those on the ballot. So talking about sort of the counterpart of these initiatives are measures put on the ballot by state legislators or triggered by law. Overall 86 and fewer for the November election. I just want to quickly talk about, the legislature isn't throwing these on the ballot kind of willy-nilly as they want to. Many of these are required by law. So 69 out of the 86 are constitutional amendments, and those in all states but Delaware actually require a vote of the people. So we go into detail about how these got on the ballot a lot more in our CPRS report. That link will be made available. We break it out by topic, by state. You can see what the CPRS is, which is the cost per required signature. So that kind of removes the variable of how many signatures are required and just shows how difficult it is to actually collect these signatures in each state. All right, next slide. All right, so this is quickly just a kind of a snapshot of the initiative states. So these are the 17 states that have initiatives or veto referendums this year. And on the right, you can see the total cost to get those measures on the ballot. So obviously California kind of ruins the curve here. California has 15 citizen-initiated measures, lots of money spent. But jumping out, you also have Washington and Oregon with a lot of measures. Colorado kind of jumps out as having 7 initiated measures. And one of those, kind of ironically, is designed to make the initiative process harder. in that state. So you see kind of a trend on the West Coast where there's a strong kind of use of this direct democracy power, this initiative process. All right, next slide. So let's talk quickly about the issue of marijuana. We don't have too much time left, but like I said, a record year for marijuana. And it's an interesting one because people have been theorizing for a while that there'll be this tipping point where if enough states legalize marijuana, you could see it legalized at the federal level where the prohibition ended. And then you actually see some legislation coming through state legislatures instead of just by initiatives. So this is an interesting issue just because the only legalization of recreational marijuana that has occurred so far has happened through the citizen initiative process. So legislatures haven't really seriously considered legalizing this yet. So let's go to the next slide. Let's finish this out. This just shows the legalization by state for this year. You can see which states have measures on the ballot: California, Nevada, Arizona, Massachusetts, and Maine. Next slide. This is medical marijuana. This is on the ballot in 4 states, including Montana, which is already legal, but they're trying to increase the number of patients allowed. We don't have time to go into this too much, so let's move to the next slide. All right, let's quickly talk about campaign finance, and then we'll end for questions. So Ballotpedia is currently tracking over 600 million in campaign funds for statewide ballot measures. 375 million of that is in California alone. And that makes sense because of the population and the kind of the controversial nature of the initiatives there. But we sort of have the reason why initiatives are, or a symptom of why initiatives and referendums are so much more interesting and more compelling. And that's over 90%, 593 million of the campaign spending that we've tracked so far. It has been spent on initiatives and referendums. That leaves very little that's been spent on legislative referrals. And then I have the list of the top 5 states there. So California, Oregon, Florida, Massachusetts, and Washington all have kind of the highest spending on their initiatives. So those are kind of the states to look at this year as far as controversial races. And more detailed information is available on the site, but let's move to questions. Thank you, Kayla.
Yeah, certainly. If anyone has any questions, good, we have some in the Q&A tool. So somebody asked, what's the difference between an initiative and a ballot measure or referendum?
Right, good question. So there are only 5 veto referendums on the ballot, so they're less common. A veto referendum is targeting a measure that was, or a bill that was passed by the legislature. So the legislature passes something, and there's a group of people or a group of citizens that don't like it. So a signature petition is circulated to put that bill, which has already been passed by the legislature, before voters and give them a chance to overturn it or uphold it. An initiative actually proposes a new law. So it's proposing some sort of regulation or policy change that the legislature hasn't already passed.
Cool, thank you. Do we have any other questions from anybody? Oh, great. We have another question. You mentioned that most of the state ballot measure spending goes to initiative and referendum. What other kind of ballots are there besides recall?
Right. So the other type, and that's a little over half of the measures that are on the ballot, were put there by the legislature. So those are legislative referrals, and most of those are constitutional amendments. And those can range from anything to changing the language in the Constitution to remove sex-specific language, for example, or tax increases, or changing the judicial retirement age. So they're usually a little bit more mundane. They're usually more technical, and they're policy changes or changes to the Constitution that the legislature wants to make. But in every state, except for Delaware, those changes have to go before voters. So it's more of a ratification process. So those are bills that were passed by the legislature. They usually want them to go into effect, but they need the voters to ratify them.
Cool, thanks. And then we have one more question in the chat. What has been the track record for ballot measures? Do most pass? Are there some states more likely to pass an initiative than other states?
Yes, we do have data on that. That would be that would be something that you'd want to look at the site for. There's a lot of details there, and you can look at our information sort of by state. And it's true that there are sort of trends regarding ballot measures. Different types of measures often are more likely to pass. So a lot of the legislative referrals are actually more likely to pass than the initiatives, just because they're less controversial. There's less of a less challenge to them. They're often sort of routine, like I said. So that's kind of a trend you can see. As far as I don't have the data right in front of me as far as which states have the best record for passing these, but it's often because of what the measures are about. So if, for example, you have one state that has a significantly higher rate of passage than another state, it's usually because of the type of measure put on the ballot. So we just did a study actually of all the constitutional amendments that have been approved and passed since 2004 or 2006. And we saw that in any state where amendments could be proposed by initiative, the passage rate was in general lower than states where that wasn't possible, where all of the amendments were proposed by the legislature. And it was maybe 15% points or something like that. So there's kind of not a huge change, but a significant enough change to make that connotation.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Josh. We're going to wrap up so we can get people out of here on time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you have more questions, please, you can email us at editor@ballotpedia.org. You can tweet at us at Ballotpedia on Twitter or facebook.com/Ballotpedia. We're happy to answer any other questions that you have. And feel free, please check out our pages. And then tomorrow at the same time, oh, thanks. Tomorrow we have another webinar about municipal government. So come if you want to hear more about partisan politics at the local level and other issues that you're facing. So thank you all so much for your time. We appreciate it. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone.
Same time tomorrow. Thanks, Josh.